Warriors. This video is for U.S. government class, and it's another Supreme Court case. So if you pull out one of these notes worksheets for the Supreme Court cases, we'll get it started. At the top of the page where there's room for the litigants to be listed, you want to write Gideon versus Wainwright. If you need to know how to spell that, look at the title of the video and that'll give you the correct spelling. So Mr. Gideon and Mr. Wainwright are involved in a lawsuit. It all starts with a crime that was committed in the year 1961. And the Supreme Court examined this case and made their decision in 1963. Now let's move on to historical context and background. The important historical context for this specific case is that the case was decided in the state of Florida, and in the early 60s, the state of Florida, in their courtrooms, judges had a habit of being a little flexible with who got an attorney and who didn't, if they couldn't afford one. And so, even though the Sixth Amendment, in the last sentence of the Sixth Amendment, it says that a defendant has the right to the assistance of counsel, or an attorney or a lawyer, if they need it, in the state of Florida at that time, a lot of judges were saying, well, you know, if it's a serious crime, a capital crime, meaning usually if you were going to be convicted of that crime, you might face the death penalty. Well, if it's that serious, we'll give you a lawyer. But if it's a lesser crime, a less serious crime, then we don't have to give you a lawyer. So the state of Florida and many other states at the same time were kind of being flexible with the Sixth Amendment. And they were saying, yeah, maybe we'll give you an attorney if it's really serious, but if it's not, we're not going to provide you with an attorney. You find a way to pay for one or you're out of luck. All right, so that's the specific piece of important context for this case, because this crime happens in the state of Florida and his criminal case is tried in a Florida court who is operating with those kind of flexible rules in 1961. Now, the constitutional issues at stake, I already mentioned the Sixth Amendment, and the part of the Sixth Amendment, that last sentence, that guarantees a defendant the assistance of an attorney or a lawyer if they need it. Also, the second constitutional issue is the 14th Amendment. And we've talked about the 14th Amendment a little bit before. The last sentence in the 14th Amendment, that Equal Protections Clause, saying every citizen, no matter who they are, is deserving of the same rights and guarantees that anybody else is in the country. So, those are the two constitutional issues at stake, the Sixth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, and this has specifically to do with legal representation or the right to a lawyer. Now, let's look at the players involved. The first player is Clarence Earl Gideon. And Clarence Gideon was born in 1910 in Hannibal, Missouri. And he, to make a long story short, he was in and out of prison most of his life. His dad died when he was about 3 years old. When he was about 5, his mom remarried, and his stepfather didn't like Clarence at all. The home was very, very strict. Clarence was constantly being in trouble. He was constantly being disciplined and punished. And so that by the time he was 14 years old, he ran away from home. He hadn't yet graduated the 8th grade, but he ran away from home, and he found his way from Missouri, which is kind of in the middle of the country, all the way out to California on the far west coast of the country. And he lived there for a year. Okay, imagine if you were 14 years old, ran away from home, and ran, 1,200 miles away. That's kind of scary and impressive at the same time. So after a year, he decides he wants to come back to Missouri, but he doesn't want to go back to mom and stepdad's house. So he goes back to Missouri and he begins to live with his uncle. When his mom finds out that Clarence is living with his uncle, she calls the cops and has them go arrest Clarence for being a runaway. And he is put in jail. Shortly after he is put in jail, Clarence escapes from jail. And he escaped in the middle of winter. It was cold outside and he didn't have any warm clothes to wear. So he goes into a store and he steals some warm clothes. And as the story goes, he was arrested shortly after with those warm clothes on, but with the sales tags still on the clothes. So you might think he's not the smartest guy in the world, but you might also agree with his family who said Clarence was really only good at two things: stealing stuff and breaking out of jail. And he's about 15, 16 years old, and he's already done both of those things. Sold some stuff and broken out of jail. So he is convicted of stealing. He's sentenced to 3 years in the Missouri State Reformatory for Boys. This is a juvenile facility. He later said in his life, and Clarence was in and out of jail for most of his life, he said later in his life that that reformatory in Missouri was the worst prison he'd ever been in his entire life. So that was a rough stretch. He spent about 1.5 years there, and then he was paroled early. He shortly after got a job at a shoe factory, and he started out making $2 a day. Before long, he was making $25 a day. His life began to straighten out a little bit. He got married, and then in 1928, when he's 18 years old, he loses his job. What does he do? He goes back to stealing stuff. He steals some things. He's arrested, convicted, sentenced to 10 years in jail. Shortly after, his wife divorces him. And then the better part of Clarence's adult life looks like that. He's in and out of jail. He serves some time. He gets out. He commits a crime. He goes back in. He gets married. He gets divorced. He gets married. He gets divorced. So he's in and out of prison for most of his adult life. And he is in and out of a number of failed marriages throughout his adult life. So let's fast forward to 1961 now. Clarence is 51 years old. He's living in Northwest Florida in the Panhandle. And he goes he goes to this bar and pool hall to drink and play pool. And one night the pool hall's broken into, and somebody breaks into the cigarette machine, the vending machine you can buy cigarettes out of, and they steal all the change out of it, probably a bunch of quarters. And there was a bottle of whiskey missing from the bar. Shortly afterward, Clarence is found, his pockets full of loose change, and he has a bottle of whiskey. There's a guy who also used to go to the pool hall and the bar, and he says, yeah, I saw Clarence take that stuff. He's the one that did it. So he goes to court, and he is being tried for breaking and entering. And he goes before the judge. Now remember, Clarence Gideon has been in and out of jail many times in his life. He's been in and out of courtrooms in lots of different states many times in his life. And he knows that if he can't afford to pay for an attorney, that the court will provide one for him because it's happened before. So when he goes into that Florida courtroom, he says to the judge, Your Honor, I don't have money to pay for an attorney. I would like the court to provide me one. But remember the historical context. In Florida at that time, a lot of these courtrooms, a lot of these judges were saying, yeah, if the crime's not very serious, we're not going to give you a lawyer. You're on your own. And that's what the judge said. He said, Gideon, you don't get a lawyer. You're all on your own. So what does Clarence Earl Gideon and his 8th grade education try to do? He tries to defend himself. How do you think he did? He lost the case. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for breaking and entering. And he goes to prison and he can't get it out of his mind that he's pretty sure the Constitution says he's supposed to be able to have a lawyer if he wants one. So he begins to study, begins to go to the law library, and he begins to study the law and the Constitution. And he begins to write letters. He writes a letter to the Florida Supreme Court saying, look, I think I'm being held illegally. My trial didn't go the way the Constitution says it's supposed to, so I shouldn't have been found guilty because I didn't have an attorney, and if I wasn't found guilty, I shouldn't be in jail. And this is where the lawsuit between Gideon and Wainwright happens. The second character in this play, in this story, is Louis Wainwright. And Louis Wainwright was the director of the Department of Corrections in Florida. And so Gideon sued Louis Wainwright saying, you're holding me illegally because my trial was conducted illegally. I shouldn't even be in jail. But the state Supreme Court, the Florida Supreme Court says, no, we think the lower court got it right. You don't get an attorney unless it's a real serious case, and so you stay put for 5 years. Then Gideon begins to write letters to the Supreme Court. And he writes a number of letters to the Supreme Court explaining to them, look, I was poor, I couldn't afford an attorney. I'm pretty sure that the Constitution says I have a right to an attorney if I can't provide one for myself. I'm pretty sure that the Constitution says that there's a certain way that courtrooms are supposed to operate, and I think that this courtroom in Florida is breaking the law. They're operating contrary to the Constitution. The Supreme Court decides, yep, we'll take a look at your case. And when the Supreme Court looks at the case, the details, they discuss it, they come back with a decision, that is a unanimous decision, 9 votes to 0 votes in favor of Clarence Earl Gideon. They say, yeah, Gideon, you should have had an attorney at your trial. And so what they did was say that trial is no good. We're going to give you a new trial. They didn't automatically let him go because he was charged with breaking and entering. But they did say, we'll give you a new trial, and this time the state better provide an attorney for you. So he went to his second trial. His attorney focused on that eyewitness, and his attorney convinced the jury that that eyewitness was a drunk, he was unreliable, he had a history of lying, he was untrustworthy, and you know what? Second time around, Clarence Earl Gideon was found innocent, and he was let out of jail. So, in the majority opinion, there was no dissenting opinion. In the majority opinion, Justice Hugo Black, that was the Supreme Court justice who wrote the majority opinion, he pointed out a couple of things. First of all, that the guarantee of counsel, or the guarantee to have an attorney or a lawyer if you need it, is fundamental and essential. Okay, it's a fundamental and essential right, and that the states have to provide it because the 14th Amendment says that the states can't operate in a way that contradicts the federal government. Okay, so Hugo Black says, look, here's the deal. You can't do it your own way. The federal government says he has the right to an attorney, then the states have to provide him an attorney. He has a right to the attorney in the states too. So that's part of his majority opinion. The rest of it says that the Sixth Amendment guarantees the accused or the defendant the right to the assistance of counsel in all criminal prosecutions, not just capital cases, and requires courts to provide counsel for defendants unable to hire counsel unless, here's the unless the right was competently and intelligently waived. So the court has to provide a lawyer to the person who can't afford it unless that person says, you know what, I don't want your lawyer. I'll be fine on my own. And some people do that. It doesn't usually turn out well for them, but some people think they can handle it and they represent themselves. So the Supreme Court in their decision says, yes, you have to have a lawyer. You have a right to a lawyer. The court has to provide it for you. I don't care what state that court is in, what county, what city that court is in. They have to provide you an attorney if you need one, unless you competently and intelligently waive your right or you surrender your right to the attorney. Now, what's the ongoing impact of this case? Well, in the state of Florida, they had been operating this way incorrectly for quite a while. And the end result was that thousands of individuals who had been tried in court and convicted without any legal representation, without an attorney, they were granted new trials or they were released altogether from Florida prisons. Florida had a mess on its hands because it had been disobeying the Constitution for quite a long time. What else is the ongoing impact or significance of this case? Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Public Defender's Office, but the Public Defender's Office essentially exists today because of this Gideon versus Wainwright case. Each county, state has to have a group of attorneys called public defenders who are ready to defend defendants who cannot afford to hire a lawyer for themselves. And in the next lesson, we'll look closely at the Public Defender's Office. You might have some thoughts about what public defenders are and kind of the quality of legal services that they provide. But in the next lesson, we're going to look at a few public defenders and we're going to discuss how the Public Defender's Office was formed, how it's funded, where they get their money, and kind of what the state of the Public Defender's Office is today. That's it for this video. I'll see you next time.